Hey, Sens fans. Today marks the return of another iteration of the long awaited deep dive series from your friends here at the Senstennial podcast. Seeing as the NHL entry draft is not too far away, today's deep dive is going to focus on Ottawa's drafting history, focusing mainly on the current rebuild era, so starting in 2018. And we're going to look at their steals, their misses, and maybe some baffling decisions. And without further ado, I'm going to leave this one to Bennett to kick things off.
All right. Thank you, Matt. So we know the draft is coming up, and I wanted to take a step back and slip into the Senators' history books for a minute and think about how the team's approach to the NHL draft has evolved in the last few years. Now, growing up as a Senators fan in the Eugene Melnyk era, I and many other Sens fans got used to the idea that finding talent in the NHL draft was this team's bread and butter. With an unstable financial situation and limited ability to entice free agents, bringing in highly rated young players was the only route to respectability. There are plenty of examples of the team's success in that regard, trading up to acquire star defenseman and future captain Erik Karlsson in 2008, drafting Mike Hoffman in the fifth round in 2009, and then Mark Stone in the sixth round in 2010. Even taking Drake Batherson in the fourth round in 2017 was another example of finding quality in the draft's later rounds. And Sens fans will also, of course, remember taking team captain and future Hall of Famer Daniel Offenson, seen here, in the sixth round back in the 90s. So even fans had faith in the team's amateur scouting, and one of the few things that we could hold on to for a lot of the dark years there. And so when Melnyk and Mark Borowiecki sat down between two ferns and announced that the team was rebuilding in September 2018, around the time that the team traded Karlsson to the San Jose Sharks, fans grumbled that at least this team had a decent pedigree of success at the NHL draft to fall back on. Those years of unparalleled success would surely be right around the corner if the team could only accumulate enough draft capital and make it count. Right? Instead, the Ottawa Senators have failed to qualify for the playoffs in 7 seasons, and as of May 2024, appeared no closer to doing so. The roster still has gaping holes on the wing, on the right-hand side of defense, and most glaringly, in goal. Worst of all, despite the success of high-profile picks like Captain Brady Tkachuk, Tim Stützle, and Jake Sanderson, the prospect cupboard is largely empty. In January, The Athletic's Scott Wheeler released his annual prospects pool rankings for every team in the NHL. The Ottawa Senators ranked 31st out of 32 teams, while other rebuilding franchises like Buffalo and Detroit ranked first and second, respectively. So even as the team struggles to find consistency and seems unable to take the next step into playoff competitiveness, there doesn't seem to be anybody waiting in the wings to step up and fill some of the gaps. So, how did it end up like this? Well, starting with the 2018 NHL draft, when the Senators selected Brady Tkachuk 4th overall, the Senators have picked 44 players in total. Few players taken outside of the first round have made an impact at the NHL level, and there have been some notable busts and missteps along the way. In addition, considering the tear it down to the studs nature of the Sens rebuild, the team hasn't actually had that many high draft picks with which to strengthen the prospect pool. There are two threads that tie together the story of Sens drafting since 2018, a lack of quantity and a lack of quality. Both of these can be traced back to the team's amateur scouts and ultimately the now departed general manager Pierre Dorion. The Senators spent too much draft capital trying to strengthen a team that wasn't ready to compete and frequently mismanaged the draft capital that it did retain by reaching for low ceiling players that haven't moved the needle on the team's overall fortunes. This has left the team adrift, with neither a deep prospect pool nor a competitive roster. It's a problem that the new ownership group and new GM Steve Staios are going to need to unravel.
Yeah, and I think this is something that we had talked about before we came on and recorded tonight is, when you're looking at some of the drafts, guys like Zach Ostap, so wow, I butchered that one, Zach Stapchuk, he's a guy who could pan out to be a solid depth forward for the Ottawa Senators. But, you look at some of the guys who are already making their presence felt at the NHL level, and Logan Stankoven is one of them. He was a guy who many pegged as going in the first round, and he slipped into the late second round. And that's a guy where when you're the Ottawa Senators and you have prospect covers that are emptying quicker because you're, graduating a lot of these guys at the NHL level, you need to take swings on some of these guys who are highly touted, and maybe they don't fit the archetype you're going for. And obviously, Ottawa, especially during that 2021 draft class, you could really see they were going for a lot of players who had size to them, and Logan Stankoven didn't fit the bill. Now, that's just one example, but like you said, guys who have low ceiling but are maybe safe bets to maybe become a bottom six forward. Like they are that build that makes sense for them to grow into an NHL player, but not necessarily be an impact player. And I think that's something that's plagued the team for a while. But I know you're going to get into a quantity quality little debate right now, so I'll let you get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. And there's two main problems with the Sens approach in the last number of years that I've seen. And it's burning the candle at both ends because we've frittered away too many draft picks and we haven't made the ones that we kept count. So first, we're going to talk about the former problem, and that's that quantity has a quality all its own. There's a quote often attributed to Joseph Stalin that states that quantity has a quality all of its own. What it means is that sometimes having enough of something can make up for not having the best. There's a kernel of truth to this when it comes to the NHL draft. If you make enough selections, especially in the first and second rounds, any team is statistically bound to end up with some quality NHL players. There's an element of risk with any potential prospect. Plenty of highly rated young players stumble and fail to reach their potential due to a variety of factors, whether it's injury, regression, or stagnation, and that's always a risk. So no one's expecting that you hit on every single guy that you pick. So in that sense, making sure the team picks high and picks often is a key determinant in the success of any rebuild. Let's take the example of the two deepest prospect pools in the league per Scott Wheeler's piece from earlier this year, Buffalo and Detroit. Buffalo has made 47 selections starting from the 2018 draft, including a whopping 10 in the first round and 2 first overall picks, defenders Rasmus Dahlin in 2018 and Owen Power in 2021. Meanwhile, the Detroit Red Wings have had less luck at the draft lottery, but they've still picked 61 times between 2018 and 2023, accumulating 9 first-rounders along the way. By comparison, the Senators lag behind both of these teams in terms of overall picks, 44, and first-round picks, 7, over the same period. Worryingly, the team hasn't had a first-round pick since 2021, despite finishing 26th in 21-22 and 21st in 22-23. The Senators have made many trades since 2018, with draft capital coming in and out depending on when the deal was made. Moving star players like Erik Karlsson, Mark Stone, and Matt Duchene netted the team some decent draft picks. Most famously, the unprotected first-round pick in the 2020 NHL draft that the Sharks sent to Ottawa as part of the Erik Karlsson deal became third overall pick Tim Stützle when the wheels came off of San Jose's season in 1920. Zach Ostapchuk, who looks a decent prospect, was taken in the second round in 2021 with a pick stemming from the same deal, which was also included prospect Josh Norris. The Duchene deal with the Columbus Blue Jackets landed the Sens with a single first-round pick in 2019, who became Lassie Thompson, while a second conditional first-round pick never materialized. The Mark Stone trade with Las Vegas was centered around prospect Eric Brandstrom, although it did include a second-rounder in 2020 that the Sens turned into fringe NHLer Igor Sokolov. One other deal of note was flipping J.G. Pajot to the Islanders at the 2020 trade deadline, which brought in the first-round pick that would become Ridley Gregg at 28th overall. These deals brought some significant talent to the roster, although it has to be said that the exceptionally fortunate circumstances around the Karlsson trade are doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. And you'll note that Igor Sokolov has yet to really crack it in the NHL, and Lassie Thompson has recently left the organization to return to Europe. So I think that overall, we could have done, I think Sens fans would have hoped that we did better with the draft picks that we got back from the fire sale, but that's a conversation for another time. But for all of the picks that the Sens acquired, many of them never made it to draft day. Too many of the picks that the Senators have accumulated were spent on bringing in established NHL players who either fell flat in Ottawa or were otherwise unable to move the needle. In 2020, the Senators spent 5 draft picks, among other minor pieces, to acquire defenders Josh Brown and Erica Branson, winger Austin Watson, center Derek Stepan, and goaltender Matt Murray, all of whom had unsuccessful spells in Ottawa. Most of these players were traded away by the Senators shortly thereafter, although for lower value picks than the ones that were spent to acquire them. In the case of Matt Murray, he actually cost the Sens 3 draft picks when you take into account that the team needed to send 2 additional picks to the Toronto Maple Leafs in order for them to take on his contract in 2022. Moves for Sens Twitter whipping boy Travis Hamonic, a 2022 third rounder, and the 2 picks sent to Chicago to offload Nikita Zaitsev's contract further reduced the team's draft capital. There were picks coming in the whole time as veteran players were shipped out at each subsequent trade deadline, but the Senators still ended up at a net loss, thanks to the many picks expended to acquire ineffective veterans and then to pay other teams to take them off our books. However, the flurry of late round picks the Sens have wheeled and dealed since 2018, and we know that Pierre Dorion loved nothing more than wheeling and dealing. These pale in comparison to the prized first rounders that the team has given up on big swings for star players. The first of these was the 2017 three-team blockbuster that saw the Sens ship Kyle Turris and an unprotected first-round pick to acquire Matt Duchene from Colorado. When the Senators imploded in the back half of the 2017-18 season, it became clear that this pick would end up being extremely valuable. The team took the option to defer the pick to the 2019 NHL draft, when the cup-contending Avalanche were gifted defenseman Bowen Byram at 4th overall. The start of the 2017 season was a period of heavy optimism in Ottawa, following their memorable trip to the Eastern Conference Final a few months earlier. In that context, the Duchene trade is defensible. Duchene was a point-per-game player in Ottawa, but unfortunately his arrival coincided with a collapse in the team's performances that led to the decision to rebuild. Nobody could have expected that the first rounder they sent would turn into a lottery pick, but in hindsight, it was a risky move when the team didn't have the bones to be a contender. The Duchene trade was also a preview of things to come, as the Senators continued to pull the trigger on splashy win-now moves that sacrificed valuable draft capital even in the midst of the rebuild. To an extent, Matt Murray was a symptom of this same problem. The biggest and splashiest move of all, though, was the 2022 trade that saw the Sens move the 7th overall pick plus second and third rounders to Chicago for star player Alex DeBrincat. While seen at the time as a bold move that, alongside landing prized free agent Claude Giroux, signaled that the Senators were ready to be competitive again, this was another move that backfired. DeBrincat, it turned out, had little interest in staying in Ottawa and was shipped out a year later. The 2024 first-rounder that the team received in return, among other smaller pieces, was of a much lower value than the one that the team gave up to acquire DeBrincat in the first place. Talented young defenseman Kevin Korchinski, although considered something of a reach by the Blackhawks at 7th overall that year, would certainly be of more use to the Senators than a player who now plays for Detroit, a division rival. Now, the jury may still be out on the relative success of the move to acquire Jacob Chychrun from Arizona, RIP, shout out to Utah, I guess, because this cost the Senators their 2023 first-round pick and 2 second-round picks in 24 and 26. There have been times when Chychrun is flattered to deceive as a Sens player, but he has tended to go missing when the team needs him most. Trade rumors continue to swirl, and there's a good chance that Chychrun will be dealt this offseason if his future with the team remains uncertain. Regardless of whether you feel Chychrun has been good for the Sens or not, the fact remains that the move to acquire him deprived the team of draft capital that would have been more useful in the long run than yet another player destined for the exit. All signs at the moment point to this being another net loss for the team, who gave up a lot to bring in a player that has done little to alter the trajectory of the team. This doesn't even mention the first-round pick that Dorion lost by failing to disclose Evgeny Dodonow's no trade clause to Vegas, once again removing valuable pieces from the rebuild. Now, what unites all of these various transactions is a persistent inability by the organization's leadership to read the room, to understand where the Senators are or were as a team and what they needed to take the next step. At times when the team wasn't expected to be competitive, the Sens spent draft picks to take on low-skill veterans who did little to help the development of the team's young players. Some of these veterans, like Murray, required further draft picks to offload after the fact. On the flip side, GM Pierre Dorion tried to kickstart the Sens rebuild several times by making splashy moves for players who were not a long-term fit with the team. Instead of hoarding draft picks to slowly accumulate the amateur talent needed to build out a roster, the Senators chased quick fixes and short-term gains. The end result is a rebuild that arguably has lost its way, and a team stuck in the basement without the picks and prospects to show for it. It seems clear at this moment that the Senators would have been better holding off to as many of its draft picks as possible instead of frittering them away on poorly thought-out moves.
Yeah, that's totally fair. Now, part of me does wonder what the draw for a player like Giroux would have been if Ottawa hadn't made the trade for DeBrincat, because I remember at the time he said that that was a draw for him, seeing them kind of go out, grab DeBrincat. So sometimes I wonder if the domino effect of not trading for DeBrincat means not getting Claude Giroux. But that's not, I mean, you look at Claude Giroux and he's entering the final deal of his contract now. And, the first season when he was here, his expectation, he's like, hey, listen, we're not trying to be, or we're not in the contender status yet, but we'd like to, compete for a playoff spot. That was his first season with Ottawa. And they missed, 6 points. We all bring that up this past season. That seemed like that was the time they were going to make the playoffs, like just the trajectory of the team. But no, you had Tim Stützle, who said he was nursing an injury for most of the season, have a down year after having a 100-point season, or
90
sorry,
points.
90-point season. I was getting a little ahead of myself. I was going to say that
Yeah,
you would anticipate he was going to get 100 points this
sure.
past
Yeah.
season. But yeah, sorry, after a 90-point season, hoping that he was going to take another step just because of how he had been progressing. Obviously, he regresses. You have Claude Giroux, who had 35 goals last season, which was a career high for him. He takes a step back. Brady Tkachuk got a new career high in goals, but again, his points took a step back. You had defenders getting injured. Chychrun was actually healthy, and his health was the major concern, but he didn't really do as much as you'd hoped. In Arizona, he was a star defenseman when you watched him for the most part. And in Ottawa, you got flashes here and there, but it just kind of seems like you said, like they went after these big name guys to bring Cat,
Mhm.
Claude Giroux. And I'm not saying Claude Giroux was bad, but this is what happened.
Mhm.
Cam Talbot, who had,
Yeah.
just been to the All-Star game. Which at the time I kind of get what he was doing. Like I was
Mhm.
fan of trading Gustafson 1 for 1, but whatever. Gustafson's had a bad season now too. It's whatever. It's a wash.
Mhm.
um, but you go for these names, you go for Chychrun, and it doesn't amount to anything. You didn't get closer to the playoffs.
Mhm.
You
In fact,
didn't,
we got further away.
yeah, and it just sucks. And then, like you said, DeBrincat goes to a division rival, and you've basically downgraded that pick from 7th to 25th
Yeah.
when you look at how far it's dropped
Yeah.
since Ottawa traded DeBrincat and got Boston's first round pick. So I'm sure that thankfully this draft does have a good amount of talent, so Ottawa could certainly get themselves a solid player at 25, like they've done with Ridley Gregg when they got him at 28th. But it just kind of goes to show that, you know, you could have had a guy like Korchinski at 7 or someone of that caliber, maybe even better, depending on who they take. You could have had, um, I mean, we're going to talk about 2021 at some point, but instead of Tyler Boucher, you could have had potentially your next franchise goaltender. Hypothetically, Wallstead has that potential. So there's just all these moves that they made where instead of going for the flashy play, which I get it, you want to show fans that you're going for something. I don't know. It just obviously hindsight's 2020, but it just feels like it's amounted to just more disappointment. And you don't have any guys to get hyped about. Like I'm glad Belleville did well, but when you look at their roster, like who was I hyped about seeing perform? I guess Halliday. And Halliday, we had him on the show, and really nice guy. Uh, love that he's a Leafs hater. Respect. That's maybe why the Sens took him. And he looks to be one of our highest upside prospects. And he's a guy they drafted in the 4th round who likely is like a third liner, maybe a guy who could play in your second line in the case of injuries. But like that's the most hyped prospect the Suns have right now.
Yeah.
And ideally, you have at least one guy in your system who you look at and you're like, that guy's going to make a difference in a year, 2 years. But you're like, that guy's going to be a difference maker. They don't have that at any position. So ramble over, but essentially, I get what you're saying. Like there's a lot of missed opportunities, swings for flashiness, when sometimes you just got to stay the course and trust in yourself to get the team there through the draft and taking, I would say, instead of big swings, kind of taking those like small steps that are sneaky good, where you're adding players through free agency who maybe don't have the shine around them as like a name, but have a lot of qualities that make you a better NHL team than just, you know, being a big name player who has a
Mhm.
lot of hype around them. So
Yeah.
I think I'll end my rant there, but yeah, happy to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I think Again, you're exactly right. Middle six forwards are an important part of any contending team, but they are a lot easier to acquire than top six forwards. And if you're trying to add top six forwards or top four defensemen or a starting goalie through the trade market, you're probably going to get burned more often than not. Because if anyone's a legitimate star, they're not getting traded. And so you're already dealing with the people who, for whatever reason, aren't a fit with the team that they're already on. So you're already looking at perhaps diminished value. So what you really want to do, and what most successful teams I think do, is they target really high ceiling guys through the draft. And you make a lot of picks a year, especially if you're a rebuilding team and you're taking picks off of other teams. Like, you have the opportunity to make a lot of selections. And when you're doing that, you just got to go for it. That's really it. Like, you have to think of every pick as an opportunity to take a top six player or a top four defender or a starter goalie, right? And if you're trying to build out kind of depth players and role players through the draft, you're really wasting the opportunity that's given to you. Whereas, anyone can go out and acquire like I don't want to knock Ridley Gregg at all. Like, I think Ridley Gregg is a really promising player. But guys like him are available. Like, a team like the Rangers were able to acquire Barclay Goodrow, who has some of that same kind of like uh intangible skill that he brings to the table, and they've been able to find some success with him. But it's like they didn't have, like, they maybe had to overpay a little bit for him, but it wasn't impossible to find that kind of skill set and add him to their team after the fact, right? They already had your Lafrenières and your Kakos and your Mika Zibanejads, if we're talking about Sens whiffs, which we are. But anyway, which brings us to the second part of the conversation of Brett Sens drafting, which is the quality. And if you were to ask Sens general manager Pierre Dorion what his favorite Halo game was, he would probably say Reach, which is coincidentally his favorite thing to do in the draft as well. So, unfortunately for the Senators, an analysis of the team's drafting since 2018 indicates that holding on to these draft picks may not have moved the needle much either. At the high end of the draft, the Senators have managed to stand on business. Brady Tkachuk at 4th overall in 2018, Tim Stutzla at 3rd overall in 2020, followed by Jake Sanderson at 5th, are franchise cornerstones that have established themselves as league standouts in their respective positions. Outside of the top 5, though, the Senators have had a hard time making the most of the picks they've accumulated during the rebuild. Of the 44 players that the Sens have selected at the NHL draft since 2018, less than half have played a game in the NHL. When you remove the team's 7 first-round selections from the equation, things drop off significantly. Only 6 players that the Sens have picked from outside the first round since 2018 have played more than 10 NHL games. That means that the vast majority of the team's later round picks are failing to yield players capable of making an impact at the NHL level. The 2021 NHL draft, the last in which the Sens had a pick in the first round, was especially disappointing. Only Zach Ostapchuk, out of the 6 players from his draft class, has made an appearance for the Sens. With 7 games played so far, he's still a fringe player. No players from 2022 or 2023 have made the transition, although both of these drafts were stymied by the first-round picks the Sens spent on DeBrincat and Chychrun. There are 7 players taken since 2017 who have passed the 50 games played mark. Brady Tkachuk, Jacob Bernard-Docker, Shane Pinto, Mark Kastelik, Tim Stutzla, Jake Sanderson, and Ridley Gregg. Frankly, of the remaining 30-plus players who haven't passed that threshold, it's hard to imagine many of them making an impact. Tyler Kleven and Zach Ostapchuk seem the most likely to claim roles on the team, but other than that, the pipeline is pretty much dry. So what's been going wrong for the Senators? Amateur scouting was once a strength for the organization and for GM Pierre Dorion in particular. Dorion oversaw all of the drafts in question and was once considered a man with a key eye for amateur talent. Well, first it has to be said that for many of the years in question, the team's hockey operations department was understaffed and under-resourced. The impact of the austerity of the Melnyk era wasn't just found on the ice or in the concourse at the CTC. Prior to the sale of the team, the Senators' front office was staffed by a skeleton crew of Melnyk and Dorion loyalists. There were times, especially around 2020 and 2021, where it seemed that the Senators were really only drafting players from Finland, the US National Team Development Program, and the QMJHL. This seemingly small net was likely due to a lack of resources, leading the team to go back to the well time after time.
And I want to interject here for a second because you're right. Like, there's no question about it. They were understaffed and under-resourced. And I think what's interesting is now you see this new ownership regime come in, and from what I've heard, it seems to be the opposite now, which is great. The scouting staff isn't huge by any means, but what they haven't necessarily added in manpower, or just individual amateur scouts of whatever you want to say. I don't know where I'm going with that, but what I'm trying to say is that I know they're spending more money now on maybe not personnel in the amateur scouting staff. That's what I'm trying to say, but instead with getting analytics, data on players,
Yeah.
touching base with more freelance individuals, and trying to get maybe a wider net, like you mentioned the net analogy. I think now we're seeing that happen more, and unfortunately, it took firing your coach, most of your front office, and having a complete change in ownership to get that. But I think hopefully from here on out, and I know we still have a little ways left to crap talk the previous Sens draft picks, but hopefully we'll start to see the fruit of that spending in the front office and scouting and analytics in general.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no salary cap for the front office of an NHL team, and those guys make a lot less money than players do. And so, if you want to spend $6 million to improve the team, sure, you could get one player and you have to fit him in around the cap, or you can get a first-rate analytics department, a first-rate scouting team, a first-rate physio team, medical team, and those things can go a huge way towards making your team more competitive in the long run. And so I think Andlauer and co have correctly identified this as a weakness from the previous Sens regime and have already made some positive steps toward rectifying that. Now, circling back to the draft, I know that every team can point to examples of players they drafted that were followed immediately by emerging stars, and the Sens are no different. One pick after Tyler Kleven in 2020's second round, the Kings took Brock Faber, now an emerging talent for the Minnesota Wild. A few spots after the Senators made the puzzling choice to take Tyler Boucher at 10th overall in 2021, highly rated goaltenders Sebastian Cossa and Jesper Wallstedt were taken by Detroit and Minnesota, leaving a key organizational need unfilled. But this is also true of all teams at all times. Sometimes you hit and sometimes you miss. And for every future stud that the Sens passed on, half a dozen other teams did too. For me, the more worrying trend is the fact that the Senators have shown a preference for high floor, low ceiling prospects instead of using their many picks to swing for the fences. The 2020 NHL draft, which is the centerpiece of the Sens rebuild, is a good example of the team's risk-averse approach to the draft. Of the 10 players selected that year, 4 of them, Igor Sokolov, Eric Engstrand, Philip Deust, and Cole Reinhardt, were overagers. Although overage players give teams more time to scout and offer teams more assurance, they're also less likely to be game-breaking talents, something that the 2020 NHL draft was full to the brim with. The Senators also tend to draft a disproportionate number of players whose fathers were NHLers, perhaps again because these are perceived as low-risk prospects who have the tools to make it to the NHL. There was definitely a feeling in recent years that the Sens have become predictable at the draft. And I know in your recent interview with Scott Wheeler of The Athletic, he mentioned something similar, that for a few years there was a sort of Ottawa Senators type of player that other teams knew that they would target in the draft each year. And many of the profiles of players drafted by the Sens in recent years make for familiar reading. Large, physical players with a high work rate and compete levels. Now, these are important skills to have, and anyone who sees the way that Brady Tkachuk plays or Ridley Gregg plays can see the virtue in selecting players with strong intangibles and a physical edge. Look no further than the decision to take Tyler Kleven in the second round that year. The Sens packaged 2 picks to the Leafs so that they could take Kleven, Sanderson's roommate at the U.S. National Team Development Program, prioritizing intangibles, team dynamics, and familiarity over high-end skill. Kleven has the tools to be a responsible bottom-pairing defenseman, but probably not much more than that. Faber, another graduate of the National Team Development Program, who was taken with the very next pick, is not as large or as physically imposing as Kleven, but projects to be the much better of the two. Tyler Boucher, the Sens' top pick in 2021, was another example of the Sens reaching for a specific kind of player rather than going with the consensus. Boucher was a right wing with good size and strength and some offensive upside. He was projected to go late in the first round and probably topped out as an NHL third liner. However, Boucher attracted the attention of the Sens scouts by ticking all of the boxes they seemed to focus on: physicality, intangibles, and NHL pedigree, because his father was goalie Brian Boucher. Taking Boucher at 10th overall was puzzling at the time, even more so as his career stagnated post-draft. After bouncing between the NCAA and the OHL, Boucher spent the 2023-24 season in Belleville, where he failed to make an impact, scoring 5 points in 21 games played. He doesn't appear primed to make his NHL debut anytime soon. But Boucher was part of a larger trend, whereby the Sens seemed to be trying to build a certain kind of team through the draft. Rather than prioritizing high-end skill sets, the Senators seemed to target middle six or bottom four role players, often who were large and physically dominant. This was consistent with the team's messaging at the NHL level. During the 2020 and 2021 seasons, Coach DJ Smith as well as Dorion spoke constantly of the need to be hard to play against. Leaving aside the Senators were terrible during those years and were not especially hard to play against at all, it seems clear that this attitude was adopted by the whole organization, including the team's scouting staff. The problem is that targeting this kind of player showed a small-minded approach to the draft. Players like Boucher or Clevin or other low-upside players who are only likely to ever crack the bottom half of an NHL lineup are not that hard to come by. It's the high-risk, high-reward players that are valuable, either as roster players or as trade pieces. Projecting how a player is going to turn out is always difficult, but if you shoot for the moon every time, you're more likely to come away with some game-changing talents. If you play it safe and put your faith in intangibles, you're more likely to be disappointed.
Yeah, and honestly, when it comes to Tyler Boucher, obviously he is a lightning rod who takes a ton of criticism. And like you said, it's not necessarily that they selected Tyler Boucher. It's the symptom of a bigger disease,
Yeah.
essentially, where I think the catalyst for the anger about the Tyler Boucher draft selection was it was at 10th overall. And I get it, like, for me, when I saw how the top 10 was shaping up, I thought, hey, maybe Dylan Genther will drop to Ottawa at the 10th, or sorry, at the, yeah, 10th spot. But he went to Arizona the pick before at number 9. And so for me, organizational need, best player available was Jesper Wallstedt. It seemed like a no-brainer. But they decided to go off the board and take Tyler Boucher, who's projected to, like you said, go late first, early second, because he fit that mold of player they wanted. And it seemed like, I don't know if there were media members trying to justify it afterwards or something, but it was like, oh yeah, other teams were interested in taking him. And it's like, that's great and all. But when it comes to the draft and the first round and the top 10 in particular, you have the ability to take a player who, sure, might have some risks to them, but they have a lot of upside as well. And, you know, Tyler Boucher was one of those guys who I didn't ever see that high upside component. I was actually quite confused when they took him. I was like, what? But this guy wasn't like a standout in any way. So again, now it seems like I'm focusing criticism at Tyler Boucher, and that's not what I meant to do. But essentially, it's just when you go for that type of player and you go, like Kaslik, and he was a 5th round pick, that's fine. Although Kaslik has had ups and downs during his time with the Sens, he was picked in the 5th round. The fact that he made the NHL is great. Good
Yeah.
for him. And, there have been times where he's been a great presence for the Sens, and obviously other times where you're like, okay, this is why the guy was drafted in the 5th round. But all that to say, like, when you select a player like that in the 5th round, that's fine. If you're selecting a player like that in the 1st round, 10th overall, that's when it's like, okay, guys, you have your type, but Trent Mann coming out after the draft or after the 1st round or whatever it was, and he did that interview and he said like they earned the right to draft who they wanted. It's like, who? Who has told you that? Like, is it because most of your guys graduated? Like you said, most of the impact came from guys who were drafted in the 1st round.
Yeah.
You know,
And it's easy to graduate prospects. Like if you only pick guys that you think, it's like they've been picking guys who they think are just good enough to make the NHL, but those guys don't move the needle. What moves the needle is the guys that, hey, maybe there's a 50-50 chance whether they make it in the NHL or not. But if they make it in the NHL, they're making it as like a stud. And it's like that is a lot more valuable. And like I'd rather take 3 guys that are projected to be, top 6 players, miss on 2 of them and have the third one be a player that moves this team forward.
Yeah.
It's like you can hit as many, Tyler Bouchers as you want, and probably more often than not, they do end up making the NHL. But like you can't build a contender out of a fourth line or a third line, right? Like it starts at the top.
And I think one of the most savvy draft picks that they did make was taking Shane Pinto. He
Yeah.
was a guy who I think most people were like, "Oh, Arthur Kaliev's right there." And if you look at both players today, who would you rather have on your roster? It looks like the LA Kings might be shipping out Kaliev at some point. And on the other side, you have Shane Pinto, who, Sens fans are like, is it worth paying him like 5 mil for 6 years? Which is a whole other conversation. But
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
fact of the matter is, this is a guy who Sens fans are like, we need to get him signed.
Yeah.
People making memes on Twitter, and I can't remember the count off the top of my head, but making Shane Pinto's head slightly bigger every day until he gets re-signed or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
So it's like fans care about re-signing this player.
Yeah.
And he's a guy who the Sens got at the beginning of the second round in, I believe, what was it, 2019?
Yeah.
And he ended up turning out better than their first round pick that year. Yeah, you look at things like that, and he was a guy who's kind of risky, late bloomer. He had some good abilities, but he wasn't like a standout. But you could see that he had some skill and talent there, but he was still kind of raw because he had
Yeah.
spent less time playing professional hockey. And
Yeah.
I was okay with that swing. And anyway, yeah, and it worked out well. But
Mhm.
it's knowing when to take a swing at a player, and you know when to, I guess, like, not overthink things. Maybe the Sens haven't been overthinking. It just seems silly. Like, you have some solid talent right in front of you, and again, you go back to like JJ Paterka. He's a guy who played with Tim Stützle. They had really good chemistry at the World Juniors, and then you draft, Roby Yarventi, and Yarventi is not a bad player, but I don't know if he'll ever crack into the Sens top six, and I don't know if he's really a bottom six player. So
Yeah.
anyway, all this to say, it's just there's some frustrating decisions that have been made for sure.
Yeah, and you said whether the Sens have been overthinking things. I think they've absolutely been overthinking things. Anyone with off the street that you talk to would say, "How do you draft in the NHL?" So you say best player available. That's what you always do. That's what everyone says. Unless if you have a specific reason not to do that, you take the best player available. And it seems like the Sens for a while there were really trying to 4D chess everything. They were saying, well, what if we take the player who can be a really excellent third liner? Think of someone that can really pop off in the playoffs, And it's like, I think that's what they're thinking with picks like Tyler Boucher, right? They're like, oh, like imagine like what he could do in like game 6 of like a Eastern Conference final. It's like, well, that's not the Sens' problem right now. The Sens' problem is that we're a basement dweller and we haven't made the playoffs in 7 years. So maybe don't take the guy that might pop off and be really good, sneaky value, 5 years from now. Take the guy that can win you some fucking games today, right? And
Yeah.
that's what you have to do. And understanding that guys take years to develop most of the time, but like think of how much further along the Senators would be if they had managed to hit on anyone with that 2021 first round pick. Because someone taken in 2021 could have been on the team this past season, whether it was one of the goalies that was available, maybe it was like a forward with a higher ceiling, like that could have been really useful considering that we had to pay $5 million for like, 2/3 of a season of Vladimir Tarasenko, when we could have given that roster spot to like someone that we had taken with that Boucher pick, right? So to bring it home, I just want to reiterate what we've already said, and it's by failing to draft well and to draft often enough, the Senators have undercut the decision to rebuild that the team undertook in 2018. Too many times this team left talent on the board by reaching for specific kinds of players instead of simply taking the best player available. In addition, the team attempted to jump the gun and spent precious draft capital on win-now moves that failed to move the team forward. Put together, the Sens have deprived themselves of talented prospects either by frivolously spending draft picks on ineffective players or by whiffing on the picks that they did keep. The end result is a team that is lagging behind other rebuilding teams in the league, with a pipeline that has gone dry just when the team needed it the most. There is hope for the team going forward. Dorion is gone, and so is DJ Smith and other Melnyk era hires who helped foster the culture of complacency that has plagued the Senators for years. The new ownership group, led by Michael Andlauer, new president of hockey operations, and GM Steve Staios, have shown a willingness to bolster the front office, and especially with regard to scouting, player development, and analytics. This should bode well for the team's drafting going forward. For all the team's misses, there is still a lot of excellent NHL talent on the team. We just need a little more to really take the next step. The hard part is that that'll take more time, more picks, and more drafts to get there now, more than it probably would have taken if they had stayed the course and trusted the process as other rebuilding teams had done before. By overcomplicating things at the draft and by trying to impatiently skip ahead to the team's competitive window, the Senators have made things harder on themselves. Hopefully, with another losing season in the books, the lesson has been well learned.
And with 3 higher picks in the draft, because they'll have an early second round pick as well, hopefully the Sens can maybe right some wrongs and give some
Yeah.
fans hope for this draft. For those of you who, are still listening, watching, and have enjoyed the deep dive, thank you. If you want to check out more draft related content from us, we had Scott Wheeler on the show. You can go check that out. We talked all about what the Sens draft strategy should be at the 2024 NHL entry draft. Definitely a worthwhile watch or listen. It's on YouTube, it's on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Recommend checking that one out. And I got to give a shout out to Bennett. Bennett did a lot of research for this episode. So, Bennett, thanks for coming on here and giving us them facts.
Of
And
course.
it's not a fun road to go down again. And I was telling you before the show, I'm like, damn it, Bennett, you're getting me all heated about things that I thought I was over. Evidently, I'm
That's the fun
not.
part of being a Sens fan, man. Is you got to get into the lore. You got to get into the history.
Yeah. So anyway, can't wait till Tyler Boucher bobblehead on opening night.
That's right.
You heard it here first. On that note, thank you everybody for watching or listening. Really appreciate it. If you want to follow us and hear all about the fun things we do or something like that, or maybe our garbage hockey takes, feel free to do so. We're on Twitter at Senstennial, Instagram at the Senstennial. We're also on Reddit and Discord, so you can find us on any of those platforms. Feel free to reach out to us. And yeah, on that note, thanks for joining us for this second iteration of Senstennial Deep Dives, and we'll see you next time.